Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in. Tonight, I am joined by a very special guest. He is the New York Times best-selling author of Eden, Coldbrook, The Silence, and the Relics trilogy. He's also written many successful movie novelizations and tie-ins for books such as Alien and Firefly. He's won four British Fantasy Awards, a Bram Stoker Award, a Shocker, a Tombstone, a finalist for the International Horror Guild. That's an old one. And a World Fantasy Award. One of his books was turned into a movie called The Silence. You can find it on Netflix. Also, Nicolas Cage was also in a movie based on one of his short stories, Pay the Ghost, I believe it's called. Uh, that's right. It's your favorite writer and mine, Mr. Tim Lebbon. Tim, how you doing?
Hey Rob, I'm good, mate. How are you?
Good. So, yeah, you have a new book out. We wanted just to kind of, I haven't talked to you in a while. I actually had to go back through my office, been kind of cleaning out my office, but I still had a copy of this.
Oh, right. You bought that one. Yeah, cool.
Yes, and this was published 2021. So it's what, 3 years now since we chatted. And I
Yeah.
want to say last time we chatted, we really just chatted about that book. We didn't really talk about anything else.
No, right.
Like all your short stories, all your novels, all just everything that's been going on. So
Yeah,
obviously
yeah.
that's what we're going to focus on today.
Cool. Yeah,
Um,
that one actually, that is my only nonfiction book, and it's my only self-published paperback. I did
okay.
that myself through Amazon. Real labor of love, obviously, is about the stuff I love doing, the running, the stupid running up and down hills and shit like that. Um,
Right.
but it was also a lockdown book, you know. It was something I'd thought about, and then lockdown happened, and I just thought, oh, I'll just finish this book, and it's sort of a aid memoir. It's like so that I can remember all the stuff I've done. People seem to really like it, and it's the good stuff about it. It's inspired a few people to go out and do 3 peak challenges and marathons and things like that, which is, it's really great for the people to
Yeah.
read it and like stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, all right. So, I want to go right into it. We're going to, I don't take up too much of your time. I try not to keep these more than an hour,
Cool.
but I
Yeah.
do want to talk about just writing in general. Do you remember at what age you kind of realized, like, oh, you know what? I think this is what I want to do with my life. Like, we're like,
Yeah.
we're like a certain period in time.
So I can remember the moment that the story I wrote, where I thought I could probably do this. I'd like to do this for a living. It's a story called Black Heart that I wrote when I was 20, which I entered into a competition and completely failed to win, but got really good feedback. Um, and I'd written since I was pre-teen. I'd written all through my teens, but it was that short story and that competition response that made me sort of think about getting more serious at it. And all through my 20s, I got a bit more serious with the writing. And then my first novel was published, excuse me, in when I was 28, I believe. Mesmer came out. I think that's about right. 27, 28. Indie press publication. Um, that was novel number one. And this year, I've published novel
So,
number 48.
yeah, no, and that's crazy. You're getting very very close to the big 5-0 on that.
Yeah.
But specifically, I mean, do you remember what it was that kind of inspired you for that first short story, or what kind of got you to that point? Because not everybody. I mean, we're writers, so we just think this is just normal stuff, but it's not really. You know what I mean? Like the fact that we
No,
want to sit down and so like what happened? Do you remember? Just kind of like what really kind of inspired you to just kind of sit down and write that first short story?
I think what it was, as I said, I'd written through my teens, and I'd ripped off other writers, been inspired by other writers is the way to put it, through my teens, and the writers like Colin Forbes, a thriller writer, and but I think that short story, Blackheart, I think it was the first horror story I'd written. I'd read horror all through my teens, James Herbert and King and Barker and all the stalwarts, But and that short story, I'm pretty sure was the first horror thing I'd written, and I think that's when my head clicked and thought, this is what I need to be writing. I'm going to be a horror writer, not a thriller writer, although I have written thrillers. You know, and a lot of my horror novels have thriller elements as well. But I think that was probably the first story that I wrote and thought this is the way I need to go. Um, and then through my 20s, I wrote hundreds of short stories, some of which saw the light of day in small press magazines. Uh, I still got a box of them in the attic, and sometimes I think to myself, I'll bring them out and publish them in a little collection because it would be interesting to see. But yeah, it was the first horror writing I did, I think, when I was like 20.
Right, but I guess my question is, what drew you to that? I always tell the story. I know people who watch this know, like, for me in sixth grade, the movie Jurassic Park came out. So I just, I started reading everything Michael Crichton wrote, even in like his pen name stuff. And then in, I think, eighth grade, I read Insomnia by Stephen King. And that was the thing that really I was like, oh, okay, this is what I want to do with my life. And that's why a lot of my earlier stuff was more horror supernaturals, because I felt like, oh, Stephen King was the inspiration. I want to be a horror writer. And then, of course, I've kind of branched out elsewhere. But I mean, is for you, I mean, like, I guess, again, is the idea of just like what really kind of just, were you reading horror at the time, or like what were you reading at the time?
Yeah, I mean, I was reading a lot of horror through my teens. Like I said, my mum gave me The Rats by James Herbert to read when I was about 10 years old. My mum was very encouraging with my reading, very liberal minded. Don't think I've got that copy of The Rats left, but at the time you'd hold the book up and it would fall open at all the dirty parts, because you're 10 years old. So yeah, it was the Rats and Stephen King, like I said, all through my teens. But even though I was reading that stuff, I wasn't really writing horror. And honestly, I'm not quite sure what the switch was that made me start writing horror. Because I read all sorts of stuff in my teens. It, certainly not just horror, and I don't just read it now. So I can't remember the switch that made me write that short story, but I do remember writing it and thinking that it was the first real horror story I'd written, and I loved it. And I loved, even pre-teen, I was reading Willard Price adventure stories, and they had dark elements in them, even though they were I suppose that they were YA novels of the time. But yeah, I've always loved writing since I was pre-teen, but hitting that horror vein was when my sort of ambitions really took off to make writing more than just a quiet hobby, really.
So, okay, you mentioned Mesmer. Mesmer was your very first novel. Now, was that the very first novel you had published, or was it the very first novel you ever wrote? And do you remember kind of at what point you decided to, make the jump from short stories to novels? Because it is not an easy thing to do. It amazes me when some writers just out of the gate just, start writing novels and they never write any short stories. And, it's, and now, quite honestly, I write so many novels that I don't think I can write a short story. Like, I'd love to get back to writing short stories, but it's so. I mean, yeah. Do you ever happen to what kind of was the thing that you were like, okay, or maybe it didn't start out as a short story and then just kind of kept going and going and going and became a novel?
Yeah, that was an interesting one, Mesmer. So it wasn't actually my first completed novel. Was during my early teens, and as I said, it was like it was a sort of Cold War rip-off of a Colin Forbes book, and I never did anything with it. But Mesmer came from selling lots of stories to the small press in my 20s. So I guess that would have been in the 80s, 1980s, long time ago, when people used to publish small press magazines at home, and it would be like an A4 bit of paper folded in half and stapled, and that's it. And when I say I sold lots of stories to these magazines, rarely got paid, but it was back in the day when people were producing these magazines as a labor of love. And like I say, sending them out, printing them at home on those old God, I'm sounding old. Those hand rolled printer things. So I probably, excuse me, I am getting over a cold, everyone, just in case you wonder why I keep bursting into streams of coughing. So I probably had 30, 40, 50 short stories published. And I started writing Mesmer, and just it ran away with me. It was sort of started as a novel, and it progressed into something that was about 60,000 words long, actually. And just at the time when I finished it, a small publisher called Tangent popped up out of the indie press in the UK, run by Anthony Barker. And they had published a couple of novels by, I believe, Derek Fox, who's no longer with us, unfortunately. I think Rhys Hughes, they published Rhys's early stuff. And they there was a call for submissions for novels, and they wanted up to 40,000 words. Mesmer was 60,000 words, so I quickly cut it down to 40,000 words and submitted it, and it was accepted. I can still remember, I phoned from work, where I was working at the time, and I can remember Anthony saying, yeah, we'd like to accept your novel for publication. And it was just one of the best moments. I was like 25, 26, probably 26 years old. One of the best moments, and I still remember it now. And I think I was paid the princely sum of about £200 for that book. But so I guess I was lucky enough to have my first horror novel accepted for publication, which is pretty amazing. It also means I've got no trunk novels to leap out of the woodwork in the future, which is a bit unfortunate in a way. I wish I'd kept that early thing I wrote in my teens, but it's long gone. I wouldn't know where to find it now.
So when you wrote Mesmer, I mean, I guess, has your writing style changed, since that very first novel, or is it essentially the same? I always hate using the terms, but, being a plotter or a pantser, or actually I heard the term also a plantser, kind of like a hybrid of those. I mean, like, do you remember how you started out with your first couple novels? Has it mostly stayed the same? Has there been an evolution in terms of your writing process when it comes to the books?
God, yeah. I mean, plantser is probably fairly good description of what I do, I think. Excuse me again. So I'm writing, yeah. So short answer, yes, my writing style absolutely has changed, and my writing methods still change book to book, to be honest. So if I'm writing it, for instance, I've written a lot of novels with Chris Golden, our good friend, one of my best friends. He and I have written 8 novels together, I think. Now we've sort of lost count a little bit. And we've written other stuff together. And usually if we're writing a novel together, we plan in quite a bit of detail. And we plan in more detail than either of us is used to. And that's usually because collaborating is just a little different. But it also doesn't mean that we stick to the plan. I mean, I remember the first novel we wrote, I wrote chapter 5 or something and sent it to him, and Chris said, it's great, but you've gone off the plan. And it was like, well, it just felt right at the time. So plantser is probably a fairly good term for how I work personally. But like I say, I honestly can't remember my writing process for Mesmer. I probably plotted it out more than I'm used to doing now. What I tend to do now, is so I'm writing a space horror novel at the moment on spec, and I'm sort of planning. I know roughly where it's going in some regards, but I'm sort of planning a chapter or 2 ahead as I go. So where I finish writing the novel, there's like 5 or 6 pages of notes for the next couple of chapters, and that sort of carries through to the end of the novel. So even though I have a rough idea where I'm going, it's certainly not plotted out in any recognizable structure. And other novels are different. I wrote The Last Storm during lockdown longhand, which was a hell of a process. I enjoyed it, but it was quite a different process for me, especially when I was left with this big pile of exercise books at the end of the novel that I then had to transcribe, and I'm not a great typist, so that took a while.
Yeah, but I guess in that instance, though, your first draft was by longhand. So when you were transcribing it, were you kind of doing your second draft, doing the revision process there on the second draft, or were you just doing kind of like the word for word, just transcribing it?
Yeah, that was that was an editing process for sure. Intentional or not, my handwriting is pretty terrible. It was terrible when I was a kid. It was I remember in like high school, I'd go for I'd actually was sent to handwriting lessons to try and improve my handwriting. It's just shit. My handwriting is terrible. Always has been. So I made the mistake of not transcribing as I went. So I was transcribing. I transcribed after I'd written a 100,000 word novel, 90 to 100,000 words. So I got the gist. It was almost like, you know, I was trying to read what I'd written and thought, I think I know what I meant there. So in that regard, it was an editing process because I was, you know, probably 20% of the novel I was sort of rewriting as I went. But also, yeah, so what I found and I loved, and I haven't done it since, but I keep meaning to, you know, write not longhand again, is the flow of information from brain to finger is very different. So I have written 48 novels with 4 or 5 fingers. I'm not a touch typist. So I'm always making mistakes when I type, and I often go back and correct the mistakes. Handwriting, the flow is much more fluid between thought and finger. And I think the physical writing process is a tiny bit slower. So I think you're given more time without the correcting, more time for your brain, for the thoughts to flow. And it made for quite a different novel, I think, for me, quite a different style. I'm really fond of The Last Storm. Unfortunately, it was there were various things that happened on release. Waterstones didn't stock it for weeks and weeks and weeks because their ordering system had messed up, and so it's sort of not found the readership I would like it to find, which was a real shame because I think it's a real different novel for me. It's like a family thriller with a surprising cosmic horror element at the end that just sort of pops out of nowhere. But yeah, back to your question about Mesmer, I think certainly my style changes, and I'd feel really uncomfortable if I didn't think that, every time I sat down to write a novel, it was the same process again and again and again. I think we're all, you know, all writers have a sort of a, if you don't feel you're progressing as you go on from novel to novel, give in.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, what was the first novelization you had done? Do you remember the very first novelization you had been contracted for?
Yeah, the first. So the first movie novelization was The Cabin in the Woods. I don't think I'd done a tie-in novel before then. I might have done a Hellboy novel for Chris Golden. My timeline's all sort of messy, but the first actual movie novelization was The Cabin in the Woods for Titan, which was sort of held back for a couple of years because there was problems with the movie studio. I can't quite remember what happened, but the movie came out a couple of years after it was ready. So that was a great process because they sent me a watermarked script so that if it appeared on eBay anywhere, it had Tim Lebbon across it, they'd know who leaked it. So that was a really great process. But I think I'd done a tie-in one before then, possibly.
Right. So the tie-ins, I guess. I mean, do you enjoy the tie-in work? I mean, you've done a good number. I mean, would you say you enjoy the tie-ins and the novelizations, and also with the novelizations? I mean, do they give you a little bit freedom? Because I've always heard, certain stories about how some novelizations will go in deep on certain characters where you don't really see them much in like the movies, or I mean, like how have you found that process?
Yeah. So your first question, I really enjoy them. I like doing so the novelizations. I've done Cabin in the Woods, 30 Days of Night, and Kong Skull Island. They always pay reasonably well, and they're pretty quick, which sounds awful and mercenary, but also I'm a working writer. So they're projects, 3 projects I was really interested in anyway. And as I say, they're quite easy. You get signed up for it and the editor says, I can't email you the script. I'll send you the printed version. And then you sweet talk them and they email you the script and the script instructions that you can't send it anywhere. And you don't, obviously, you're not going to be a dick about it. So then you cut and paste the script into a Word document, and you've got the whole story scene by scene then. And your job is to internalize a lot of the character stuff. And what I found with the novelizations especially is you can add stuff but not take stuff away. So when I did 30 Days of Night, fucking great story, fantastic movie based on brilliant comics. So it was a weird comic to movie to novel, bit of an odd transmutation of story there. But I delivered the novelization, and the editor, Ed Schlesinger at Simon & Schuster, came out and he loved it. He said, "Tim, great, you've done a fantastic job. It's brilliant." And then 2 days later, he came back and said, "Oh, you've changed some of the dialogue. It'll have to go back in." So I learned with that one that you can, they don't mind you adding stuff because that's what they want you to do. They want you to flesh the story out, add character stuff, add internalization and character thoughts, and also add scenes. I added a scene in 30 Days of Night where a polar bear wanders into Barrow and the vampires surround it and start toying with it like a cat and then tear it to pieces, which would have been so cool in the movie. The polar bear's, the most deadly land predator we've got. And for the vampires to toy with it and kill it would have been so cool. And also when I did Kong Skull Island, I'd novelized it and sort of finished, and I thought it's only 70,000 words long. So I added in a giant snake attack, which wasn't in the movie, and they loved it. So I do really enjoy doing them. With the tie-in stuff, so like the Star Wars novel I did, which wasn't a novelization, it was a tie-in, linked to all the stories. They give you a certain amount of freedom, but it's different for every project. I've done Firefly and Hellboy, and the sort of remit is a little different. The instructions are a little bit different, but generally, I've been very lucky and not had any. I mean, Firefly was probably the heaviest edit I had. Excuse me. And that was just finding the voice and I love Firefly. They got the characters have a very distinctive way of talking, all of them, and very distinctive voice. And I think I probably didn't quite get that right the first draft, but a couple of drafts, and ended up winning Dragon Award. So it sort of worked out in the end. So yeah, that was probably the hardest edit I've done on a tie-in book, I think. But I love doing them, and I've never done one that I didn't want to do or didn't enjoy. I jokingly say I've never done Dora the Explorer or anything like that, but then I've never been asked. So who knows?
So we're going to get to the new book, and I also want to talk about your new comic that you wrote with Chris Golden. But before that, so you've written, how many short stories have you written at this point? Can you even guess how many short stories?
I reckon probably about 300. I think if I went back to went in my early 20s onwards and counted from there, I reckon probably 300 short stories and about 30 novellas. I love writing novellas. I was listening to Ron Malfi and Josh Malerman did there's a podcast in the UK called Talking Scared Podcast. Neil McGrubber, I'm sure a lot of the guys watching. I'm sure you've heard of him. Fantastic podcast. Malerman and Malfi did one about their novella collections, and I listened to it today, a bit late to the party because I think it was broadcast last year, and it just fired me up about novellas again. I love writing novellas, and I think some of the best writing I've done is been in the sort of novella realm. 300 short stories. Shocking.
I mean, yeah, obviously White, if no one has read Tim's novella White, that is a classic. So do you know? Do you usually have a good idea from the jump? This is going to be a. It's probably going to be a 7,000 word short story, or this is probably going to be a 25,000 word novella, or this probably is going to be 70, 80,000 words. Or there are times where you go into it thinking like, okay, this is going to be a book, and then you realize, it's probably only going to be 20,000 words. Or I mean, or like, have you gotten to that place now where you feel pretty confident going into the project, what it's going to be?
Yeah, I think I'm sort of okay at judging, and a lot of the time, if I start writing something, it's for a particular market. So if I'm commissioned for a short story, between say 4,000 and 7,000 words, then I know what I'm aiming at when I go in. Novel wise, it's the same really. I usually like the novel I'm writing now is, like I said, the space horror novel called Vanguard, which is something an idea I came up with maybe 18 months ago that I really liked. So I know it's going to be a novel. The whole shape of the story lends itself to it being a novel, and the more I get into it, the more nervous I get about the fact that it's going to be a really big novel. I think the area that novellas, I'm fairly good at sort of judging the length of what something's going to be. The novellas I've written over the last few years have been mostly on spec, and mostly me. There was one I wrote during lockdown called The Last Day and the First, which PS Publishing published last year, which is something I really love, and people seem to have really taken that one close to heart. And that's something that I just wrote purely on spec, and I just sat down one day, and I was not really between projects. I'm never really between projects, but sometimes feel a bit of a loose end. And I just thought, I'm going to write a novella, and I don't know what it's going to be about. I'm just going to come up with a first line and launch in and see where it goes. And that was a real wonderful creative process. I think that one hit about 20,000 words. But even then, sitting down thinking I'm going to toy with this idea and see where it goes, in my head I was sort of thinking, yeah, this is going to be a novella. So I think I'm fairly, it's rare that I sit down and start writing a novel and think, oh shit, this is only an 18,000 word story. I'm pretty good at judging the length of the story architecture that's going to surround my idea, really. But a lot of the time, like I say, if I'm writing to contract, sometimes I go a bit over on short story contracts, but not to a crazy extent. I've got some friends who will write a 5,000 word story and it's 17,000 words long. I'm pretty good at writing to length, really.
So do you feel any, I guess, anxiety? I mean, with just being contracted for a lot of different projects, then basically deciding, you know what, I'm just going to sit down and write this thing that I'm not contracted for, that I don't really know where it's going to go for. You know what I mean? Like, and that was something I remember doing, when I was much younger. Living at home, didn't really have the responsibility of bills and stuff. Like,
Yeah.
you find out that there are times where you just, where you just find yourself really, just diving in, because you could, in theory, just waste, you could waste a week or two that you could have been working on another project.
Yeah. I mean, there's always the potential of that happening, I'm sort of lucky enough I sell pretty much everything I write eventually somewhere, one way or the other. But yeah, there is that risk. I'm in a sort of a weird place at the moment. I've sold another novel this is probably an exclusive. I sold another novel to Titan, which isn't going to be published for a little while. So I'm in a sort of exciting place now where I can write a new novel on spec, because I've got another one lined up, written, ready to come out in the future. And I sort of like that. I like writing a whole novel on spec. Sometimes it's cool how it's very comfortable and very, I'm in a fortunate position a lot of the time to have a contract to write to. But then writing something on spec has a certain element of excitement, and maybe that is down to the danger that you'll never sell it, and there are bills to pay. I have this constant balance between art and commerce, and thinking about both. Trying to feed Yeah. Well,
So, well, I guess my question then is, like, how many story or novel ideas do you have percolating then at any given time? Like, when you were right. Okay, so we're gonna talk about the new novel Among the Living. Was that a book that you kind of had in your head, like two or three books prior, or I mean, are there times where you just have so many ideas where you feel confident that, like, oh yeah, like I think it was like F. Paul Wilson was saying, you when you're working on a book, you shouldn't be thinking also about the next book, but the book after that. So, like, how do you kind of view it that way?
yeah. So again, back to the podcast with Malaman and Malfi. Josh was talking about how he's got the list, and I mean, Josh is a creative whirlwind. The guy's always got loads of projects on the go, and he's got very creative ways of launching into new projects to make them feel different for him and for other people, I think. So Josh has got this list of ideas. I have got hundreds of files on my computer of ideas for novels and short stories. But if you said to me now, what are the next 5 ideas you're going to work on? I couldn't tell you. I couldn't pick one and say this is the one I'm really excited about at the moment. And it tends to be that way. I mean, there are potential things, other things I might be working on in the future, like a potential audio drama, which I'm really excited about. But that's something that's been percolating for a little while. But novel wise, certainly with Among the Living. So I'll tell you where Among the Living came from, really. I mean, it's sort of the third in a very, very loose trilogy of novels I've written about climate change and environmental change. They're very loosely linked by theme, and some readers have spotted like little Easter eggs in Among the Living, which sort of hint that they're set in the same world. It's set in the same world as The Last Storm and Eden, my previous 2 novels. But the idea for Among the Living, actually, a portion of the idea comes from a concept I had for a sequel to The Thing, called The Things. And although some people have said that there are similarities to The Thing in the book, there are some similarities. But for me, the focus of that idea I had was the last 4 chapters of the novel, which obviously I don't want to talk about too much. But I think it would have been a brilliant sequel to The Thing. Instead, they made a sequel and called it The Thing, and it was the prequel. And I didn't see the point of that. But yeah, I don't. So Paul's comment about think about 2 novels ahead is quite interesting, because just occasionally, sometimes if I'm working on a novel, and I think any writer watching or listening will get this, you get a new idea for a new novel and it's much shinier than the project you're working on now, and you just want to down tools and go on and start the new novel. That happens sometimes, but usually once I'm immersed into a novel, my focus is novel wise is just on that book. I'll often have other projects on the go, like audio stuff or screenplays or comics or whatever, but novel wise I'm usually just trying to hone in on the current project, and then sometimes make notes on other ideas, but try not to let them sort of take over. If a new idea takes off, it can distract you from what you're doing, and that's a bit of a danger for me. I tend to approach projects scattershot. I'm often got different projects on the go, but in different media. The only time I'll have 2 novel projects on the go is if Chris and I are writing a novel together. For instance, we'll both be working on our own things at the same time as well.
Yeah, well, you know what? Let's talk about you and Chris.
Yeah.
You have this very first issue from
Yes.
from a Dark Horse Comics, Mortal Terror #1. Again, you and Chris Golden wrote this. How did this thing come about? How did you guys decide to collaborate? Because I know Chris, I believe, has done a lot of like he's done comic stuff in the past, but this is your first comic. So like, how did this come about?
Yeah, Chris has written like I don't think I'd be exaggerating if I said he'd written thousands of comics. He probably has. He's been immersed in the comic field for decades. He and Mike Mignola have written so much stuff together. Excuse me. And like I say, Chris, you know, he's my best friend, and we riff really well together on projects. We wrote our first novel probably 12 or 13 years ago. We've written 8 since then. And we just work really smoothly together, and we found this really cool process. We trust each other, which means we trust each other to do good work, and we trust each other to tell each other when we've done shit work. And you have to have that level of trust. You can only collaborate with friends, I think. I'd find it very difficult collaborating with somebody who you didn't really trust as a friend, you know? Mortal Terror, how did that? I think Chris had this concept, and we toyed with the idea of doing it as a novel. But then we realized it would be really cool as a comic. Just take a drink, sorry.
Yeah, while you do the drink, I mean,
yeah.
So like, obviously, I mean, writing for comics is definitely a different beast, even than like screenwriting or anything else. I mean, you're doing like panel by panel, different size panels, splash pages, everything else. So like, is that something that, because Chris is so used to it, you guys, he kind of helped you through that, or like, did you look at other comic scripts to help kind of get an idea of, how you're going to do it? And like, how was the collaboration? I mean, how many issues has there been so far on this?
So issue 3 is out very soon, and issue 4 is ready to go a month later, I believe. So yeah, we're almost done with the first 4 issues. Excuse me again. But yeah, so Chris helped me massively. Like I say, he's written so many, and also, it is my first comic, and how lucky am I to write my first comic for Dark Horse with Chris and Peter Bergting doing the artwork. Peter's absolutely incredible. His artwork's amazing. He's a real gentleman, absolute pleasure to work with. And we only had a variant cover from Mike Mignola on issue 1. How lucky am I? My first comic is fantastic. But I love, I always say I love storytelling in whatever media it happens to be in. I did my first audio drama last year. And again, I was lucky enough to work with the master on that, Dirk Maggs, who he adapted my Alien novel, and he's doing Sandman with Gaiman. He's worked with a few of the good guys, Gaiman, Pratchett, Doug Adams. So that was a great great learning process as well. But it's all storytelling, and it's just adapting to the media you're working in. Like, I've written screenplays, comics, and but Chris definitely guided me through. He sent me a few scripts and said, take a look at these. And I think I think I probably went a bit extravagant with my, you talk about splash panels and number of panels per page. And I do page 1 splash panel, page 2, just 2 panels, page 3, 6 panels across the top. And Chris is like, no, just ease back a bit. And generally 6 panels, sometimes 5, sometimes a big splash panel. But he sort of probably reined in my exuberance a little bit on sort of panel design and stuff like that. But the writing is, you're right, it's a very particular media to work in. It's very different. It's very different from prose. It's more similar to screenplays, but also quite different from them as well, because your stage direction in writing comics is you're talking to the artist. So I what I like about it is the sort of informality of your sort of stage direction. You're talking to the artist, and you don't have to be formal. Peter, can you do this? Do you think you can show the character's reflection in the sword that you're going to draw? It's still a learning process for me, I think. this cough. It's annoying me. I'm sure it's annoying you guys. I'm sorry.
That's okay. And again, I mean, I don't want to keep you much longer. And I'm sorry, I didn't know you were sick. We could have postponed. That was okay. But we're in the middle of it now. So let's talk about the new book. Let's talk about the new book, Among the Living, new one out right now from Titan. Can you just tell us, tell us like what's about and kind of maybe just, like kind of the inspiration behind it, like, and just kind of, pitch it to us, sell it, sell it to everybody.
Okay, here it is. It's called Among the Living. The metal fans among you might recognize the title from an Anthrax album. It might be inspired by that. It might not. So it's like I said earlier, it's like the third in a sort of a very loosely connected trilogy of climate change thrillers that I've written. Eden being the first a few years back, 3. Eden was released 2020. I believe it was June 2020, which was a bit of a shit year, and a shit year to release a novel, especially if it was going to be my first book tour, which didn't happen. So Eden was the first one. Last Storm was the second 2 years ago, and Among the Living is the third. So Among the Living is set in the Arctic, in sort of Arctic tundra, north of northern Canada, and it's a story about what the melting permafrost may uncover, and it features 2 groups of people, both led by estranged friends who used to be climate activists, and one of them became a bit sort of over the top in her activism. Bethan caused an accident in which a couple of people killed on a fracking site. So her friend Dean shut her away from himself, and he went off and joined a group of rare earth mineral people who search for rare earth minerals to sell the information to mining companies who'll then come in and destroy the landscape to dig up these minerals, which are worth a fortune. But the melting permafrost then covers a load of caves in northern Canada, and Dean's group go into the caves and they discover cave paintings which are very, very old, which have only just been uncovered by melting ice, and also bodies which are equally old. And then just as they realize that these cave paintings may be a warning, the bodies start to move. So it's about pathogens that have had their time and should remain frozen in frozen permafrost, but because of human action on the earth and human effects on the environment and the climate, these potential viruses are being released again, which is horrifyingly true because these things are happening, probably happening now as we speak, and viruses being released, animals catching them maybe, and then them dying away. But this novel's about a virus and I wanted to write something that wasn't like too similar to the opiocordyceps virus, and nothing too similar to that, but also more frightening. So the infection in the Among the Living is like an intelligent virus. It's almost sentient to the extent that people talk about viruses as if they're sentient. This virus wants to infect you and then infect the next person. It doesn't want to do that. That's its purpose. That's how it translates and spreads. But the virus in Among the Living, the infection is literally intelligent and sentient, and it's about them trying to stop it escaping the island that they're on and possibly infecting the rest of the world. So it's about the choice of, do you try and live and escape, or do you try and fight the virus or sacrifice yourself for the sake of the rest of the world? And that's where the story edges towards, really. I'm really proud of it. It's like, and I've said to people, it's probably the most horror novel I've written in years. And that was a conscious thing while I was writing it. I decided I just wanted to have fun with this one. I've called it a horror romp. Lots of people are enjoying it, and a lot of the people are putting enjoy in inverted commas, because it's like a bit of a trial. It's a bit of a grim novel, but it is the most horror novel I've written in quite some years, I think, and I'm really excited about it and loving the fact that people are enjoying it.
Very cool. So that is that's available right now in paperback and ebook. And I think before in the green room we were talking that there will be an audiobook, but you don't know when the audiobook will be out, right?
No, I'm not sure. So there is going to be an audiobook in the UK and the US, but I'm not. I need to chase up the companies to just sort of find out what their schedules are. But yeah, there will be audiobooks very soon available both sides of the Atlantic, which is great.
And so you also mentioned before about doing a space horror novel. Can you? I don't want to jinx anything, but can you talk anything about that, or is it more like kind of like Event Horizon type space horror, or is it like a different type of thing?
Yeah, this is yeah. I sort of don't like talking about work in progress too much. It is
that is fine. That's completely
okay,
understandable.
right.
I feel the same way too. I just didn't know if there was kind of get a little bit of a sneak peek depending on how much you had done. But completely. Well, what's coming out next? How about that? What can you tell us about you? You mentioned that Mortal Terror. I think number 4 is going to be out. What else do you have coming out soon?
Yeah, so Mortal Terror 3 is out imminently. I think issue 3, then issue 4 is out. So later this year, this might be another exclusive. I'm not sure. Pete won't mind me saying. So Pete Crowther from PS Publishing and I have written a short novel together, and we've spent a long time writing it. Long time. I mean, we've been friends for decades, probably 30 years, Pete and I. And we finished this novel eventually, and yeah, it's called Into the Wild Green Yonder, and it's going to be published later this year by PS Publishing. So I'm really excited to see that out, and I'm sure Pete won't mind me saying that. It's live. We can't edit that one out. I've told you.
Too late. It's too late. Well, okay. Well, that's really cool. So, is there a title? Can you see what the title is yet?
Yeah, Into the Wild Green Yonder.
Sorry, I missed it.
Yeah.
I'm over here multitasking with trying to do other stuff too. It's kind of a little difficult, but okay, perfect. So with a few minutes we have left, is there anything you've been reading, watching, listening to right now that you've been really enjoying? You want to recommend to other people?
Yeah. So a book that's out soon by Rio Ewers called The Bang Bang Sisters is fantastic, and it's going to be the thriller of the year, I think. Rio is a great friend, but I wouldn't recommend this stuff if he wasn't a fucking great writer as well. He really annoys me actually, because he's a singer and he's charismatic and funny and good looking and fit, and I hate him really. But in truth, he's a dear mate, and Bang Bang Sisters is just a next level brilliance from Rio. So look out for that one. I'm watching Constellation on Apple, which is great so far. I think my wife and I have only 3 episodes in. I think we've got another 1 or 2 to watch. Really enjoying that. Also, The Gentleman on Netflix, which is a bit different. It's the Guy Ritchie series based on his movie from a few years ago. Stylized gangland violence with humor. It's good fun. And Vinnie Jones, he's always great. And what else am I reading? I'm reading. I've got a few books to blurb at the moment. I always promise myself I'm going to hold back on the blurbing, and then I get asked by friends, and you can't say no. So I've got a few books lined up to blurb. But I'm reading a novel by Ross Jeffrey at the moment, Bristol writer, called oh shit, I can't remember the name. It's like I'm dead, but you didn't bury me yet. I think that's the title. But I'm like halfway through the novel and really enjoying it. So apologies to Ross if I've got the title wrong, which I might have. The book's upstairs next to my bed. But I'm really enjoying that. Ross is a good writer, good dude. Oh, and what am I listening to? So my band at the moment is Idols. I'm really heavily into Idols. Their new album, It's a Grower. I quite like it. it's not got the instant. It's got a couple of really instant catchy tunes on it. Some of the others are real workers, but I think Idols started as a bit of an angry punk band, and I'm not going to say mellowed, but they've grown into writing an album about love and empathy, and it's it's got a great message, and I'm loving getting into it. And my wife and I are going to go and see them in July in Cardiff Castle, which is going to be an epic gig. I can't wait.
So going back to the tie-ins, if you could, is there a specific tie-in or novelization that you would love to do? If there was a genie that granted you a wish, and for whatever reason, this was the wish that you were going to choose, like what would you, which would you pick?
I've been asked this before, and I've been quite lucky. I've done Aliens, was my. I remember probably about 20 years ago, I pitched an Alien novel to Dark Horse, who were doing Alien novels at the time. And I was actually speaking to the editor there when the line ended, which was unfortunate. But I've got to write an Alien novel, 3 Alien versus Predator novels, Firefly, Star Wars, Hellboy, other stuff. So I've been very lucky. But I like the idea. I quite like to write a Planet of the Apes book. I love the new films have been fantastic, but the original 1967, 70 film is one of my favorite films. And I think it's a story sort of landscape ripe for more novels. And you mentioned Event Horizon, and I hear rumors of a TV series, and I'd love to get into that world because I think it's a terrific movie. And it probably does have a little bit of inspiration in the space horror novel I'm writing, only a little. But yeah, I'd love to write an Event Horizon book. I haven't done a tie-in for a while, actually, but there's still time.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, when it comes to space horror, I think that Event Horizon is just one of those classic space horror movies that there really hasn't been anything like it. I mean, there's been other, space horror movies, but for whatever reason, I don't know if it was timing, the cast, or what it was. Because, I think I had gone back and rewatched it a couple of years ago, and it's some older movies hold up. There are certain aspects of this that holds up, but other aspects that are kind of like, like special effects aren't that great. But
Right.
I don't know. There's just something about it, though, that, I mean, it's not surprising to hear that it's inspiration, because I think anytime you would think of space horror, it just, at least for me, first thing that comes to mind is Event Horizon.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a cool idea, such a cool concept. And and it was genuinely terrifying, some of those scenes, watching the film, watching back what happened on that ship. It was I know what you mean about some of it not holding up, but what a great cast. I mean, Lawrence Fishburne and Sam Neill, and brilliant cast, great movie, great feel to it, just such a great concept. Our spaceship's disappeared. Where has it been? Hell. It's one of those, oh damn, I wish I'd thought of that.
So is there anything else you want to plug? Anything else you want to talk about? Because I don't want to keep you, you got to get some NyQuil or something and head to bed. I know it's late over there in the UK.
Or maybe a medicinal whiskey, I think. No, I think we've talked about my big thing's the new novel, Among the Living. Go get it. People seem to be liking it, and I like people liking it. I was on talk about Talking Scared podcast again with Neil McRobert. I was on there a couple of weeks ago, and in the interview, Neil said, "You genuinely gave me almost anxiety attack. I had a day when I was having real anxiety about something in this novel," and I said, "Sorry, but great." And I felt terrible saying it, but he said, no, it means it really struck a chord with him, certain elements of the book about identity. And so there are chapters in the book written from point of view of character. It's multi viewpoint, which is something I sometimes do, sometimes I don't. But some of the chapters are written from the point of view of the characters who don't know if they're infected or not. So it's what's going on in their brain. and how they're trying to convince themselves they're not infected or wondering if they are. And it's that sort of loss of identity that I think upset Neil. So yeah, so buy Among the Living. It's out now in all good bookshops and some bad bookshops probably. And are there any such things as bad bookshop? No, they're not.
So actually, going back, I guess, the point of view,
Yeah.
is that one of those things where also when you start a project, you just kind of know, like, okay, this is going to be third person, this is going to be first person, maybe even like the tense, past tense, present tense. I mean, is that something that you really just have a gut feeling for when you start a short story or a novel, or maybe as you're working on it, you're realizing, like, at this point of view is not working, this tense isn't working, something like that?
Yeah, I think it's a gut feeling, but it's also, you sort of play, you play with the story as you introduce yourself to it, and as you introduce yourself to the story, you sort of find your way into it. Like the space horror novel I'm writing is 2 points of view. One is present tense and one is past tense, and that just works for the setup and works for the setting and works for the characters. I've written The Last Storm was first person and third person, and I really like writing like that sometimes, and occasionally readers don't like it, but you sort of get I mean, I'm sure when you're writing, you get a sort of feel for what works and what doesn't, and it's not often I've written a whole novella or half a novel and then think, shit, this should be in first person, and gone back and had to change it. But occasionally that does happen, and it makes you sort of get we've both written quite a few books now. You sort of get a feel when you're going in for what feels right and what doesn't, and what is going to work and what isn't. So long way of saying, yeah, it's just a gut feeling, I think, really.
Perfect. So, all right, Tim, again, thanks for hanging out. Everybody can go check out his book, Among the Living. Actually, go check out all of Tim's books. You can find, actually, Tim, where's the best place to find you right now on, like, social media? Where are you hanging out mostly?
So I'm on Facebook and Twitter, X. I do pop up on Instagram and don't use it as much as I probably should, but then I've got a love-hate relationship with social media. I'm on Facebook and X most days. But my website as well, timlebbon.net, is always pretty much up to date. So you can find out about all my books there and all my projects. And I've got a good mate also called Tim. All the best people are called Tim, and Rob, of course. My mate Tim keeps my website up to date really nicely. So yeah, so it's all current on there.
Perfect. So, all right, again, everyone, go check out Tim's books. Among the Living is out. Also, his comic series that's new, Mortal Terror. This is issue 1. You should find it in all comic book shops. If not, ask them to order it. And yeah, thanks again, Tim. We'll see everybody next time.
Yeah. Bye. Cheers, mate. Thank you.